Hi, everyone. This is Pierre Verastein, and I'm here with Mira Youssef. And we are so glad, I think, to present. Mira, do you want to say a few words?
Just want to say hi.
Hey, nice to have you here. Mira, do you want to say a little bit about where you're from, like what organization, where you're located right now?
Sure. My name is Mira Youssef, and I'm the director of Monsoon United Asian Women of Iowa, and also one of the two staff of the National Organization of API Ending Sexual Violence, and I'm based in Des Moines, Iowa.
Great. And I'm Pierre Verastein, and I'm the assistant director of innovation and engagement at Casa de Esperanza, the National Latino Network. And Mira's organization and we are at Casa de Esperanza, we're partners in a grant from the Office of Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice that looks to specifically work on intervention and prevention on campus. So we are very excited to be here and to kind of share some of our knowledge and experience with you. So let's just kind of just dive in. We have 4 objectives for today, and let's hope that we meet all of them. The first one is we'd like to expose you to the OVW Campus Program, so that if you are interested in receiving funding from the Department of Justice, you know where to find that. You will know where to find the information, and hopefully you can apply. Right now there are about 150 or so grantees who are part of this program. There are different universities, and there are some in Colorado. The second objective is to understand the contextual considerations to work with international students who are survivors of sexual violence. And I'll put a caveat here to say that this grant covers more than sexual violence. So we'll also be kind of talking about intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and stalking, which are the 3 crimes that the grant covers itself. The third objective is for you to gather concrete strategies to provide services to international students on your campuses. And the fourth one is to obtain concrete prevention models that you can implement on campus. So the OVW Campus Program is under the Grants to Reduce Sexual Assault, Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, and Stalking on Campuses. And you can find all of that information at the Office of Violence Against Women of the Department of Justice, and there is the link that we can also probably send out via the chat if you wanted to find all the grants and all the information. So really quick, the Grants to Reduce Sexual, Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, and Stalking really strengthens the response of the institutions of higher education to those crimes that I mentioned. And it asks the institutions to enhance their collaborative efforts with local law enforcement, with victim advocacy organizations, and we'll go a little bit into that. So there are a number of components to the program. And all the eligible applicants really are the institutions of higher education, from community colleges to 4-year institutions to programs that are, that operate, that are, large institutions, 50, 100,000 people. We have programs that are from rural communities, again, community colleges, minority serving institutions, including HBCUs, tribal colleges and universities, and HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions. So there is a range of programs that receive these grants. So at its core, the OVW Campus Program really is asking campuses to look at violence prevention and intervention comprehensively. That means that the grant asks campuses to look at their law enforcement responses, to train their campus administrations, to train their different departments in general, to work with faculty, to foster community partners, so to look outside of the campus bubble, if you will, and look into at what resources exist in the community. It also asks the programs to train their disciplinary boards, to bring in prevention specialists, to provide victim services. And then there are these other 3 areas that are really important for the campus program, and that's engaging men. So figuring out a way to really intentionally engage men in violence prevention, to increase the cultural competency of intervention and prevention responses, and then to be compliant with federal law, or in this case, clery. And obviously Title IX and all the other laws that go, that many of you are aware of. So the campus program really under OVW is a very comprehensive grant that looks at a number of areas. It doesn't just, kind of give money to people and say, do what you want with it. It says, here is the money, and this is what we know from 20, 25 years of doing this kind of work. This is what we know kind of works on campuses. So please, try to replicate or to focus on specific areas like working with law enforcement, working with campus administration, working with disciplinary boards, training staff in specific, ways. But there is also tremendous flexibility in that the campuses themselves get to determine how and what type of trainings and work resonate best within their universities. So the solicitation process starts in around January. That's when it typically opens, and you'll receive guidelines for writing the grant. There are documents that need to be included as part of the solicitation, et cetera, et cetera. And then you typically have about 6 to 8 weeks to submit the application. So around February or March, and then you hear back around September or so, and then your grant starts the following October. And they are typically around 3-year grants. And so if you wanted to look at what the previous solicitations were, you could go to this link on the bottom of your screen, www.justice.gov/OVW/closed solicitations, closed-solicitations. And there you will see all the solicitations from the Department of Justice under the Office of Violence Against Women. And you can find the campus program there and see what the previous solicitations were. And hopefully that can give you some idea. All right, so this particular webinar, that was part of the introduction of the campus program and what it is that they fund. Now, this webinar specifically is focusing on working with international students. And again, I mentioned that the caveat that I'm bringing is that while the original kind of presentation said sexual assault, we're really going to be expanding to include more, the 3 crimes: intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So working with international students requires really a coordinated effort among different agencies. It requires a commitment to constantly self-reflect and self-evaluate what you're doing. It requires a commitment of law enforcement, of the disciplinary boards, of victim service agencies, and other agencies, to be honest, to increase their internal capacity and knowledge around working with different identities, different cultures, different beliefs, as well as to develop a nuanced understanding of anti-oppression frameworks. So it kind of requires us to place the experiences and voices of communities of color and international students at the center when we are developing services and prevention models. So I want to kind of let's start with taking a step back and doing some of that self-analysis and self-reflection around some of these important pieces that are foundational to work with international students, to work with communities of color on campuses. Because what has typically happened is we replicate models that already are in the mainstream, and what we want to do is kind of peel the onion, right? Take the layers away to see how we can provide services, intervention, or prevention that are culturally specific. So if we're going to be talking about culturally specific programming, we kind of first want to talk about what is culture. So historically and anthropologically, culture has been thought to be a stable pattern of beliefs, values, thoughts, norms, et cetera, that are transmitted from generation to generation to successfully adapt to other group members and their environment, right? So in other words, this is a very static definition. It's we are transmitting something from generation to generation for successfully adapting to the other members in the group or to the environment. And we know that this is not particularly a modern or a nuanced understanding of what culture is. So in order to kind of dive into a little bit, I want to do a little bit of a group reflection, which I know is a little bit strange on the webinar. So on a webinar setting, so if you can take, get on the chat, and then I can ask you to kind of reflect on what your self-identity is. What are some of the most important values in your culture and to you personally? And what historical events have shaped your life experiences? If you can answer one or those, or any of those questions on the chat, Josh will read them aloud, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation. So while the group kind of types in your responses, I wanted to share a little bit of my experience to kind of give you an example. And my identity really is, I'm a gay, undocumented immigrant Latino who lives in Boston, Massachusetts. And these identities have obviously shaped everything that I do, right? And all the lenses that come into play. So as an undocumented immigrant, I've become really aware of what it means to live in a country that whose current kind of landscape is shifting. As a gay male, I remember clearly in my experiences in Peru, where my family, or where kind of the constant media messages that we would be receiving, you would have religious leaders say that gay people would be going to hell, that they didn't deserve to live, and this was coming from people who were, kind of leaders in the community, if you will. And so all of those, things, if you will, or all of those messages end up shaping how I viewed myself for many, many years, and how I came to experience the world around me. So Josh, I don't know if you have any answers on the chat that you would like to read.
We've got a couple. First is, I am a Japanese Chinese queer woman. Next, important values: independence, equity, self-determination. Still waiting on some others to come through, but I can share some of my personal experience. I grew up in rural Colorado in the mountains, and so very, very much so in our community valued the outdoors and things like mountaineering and fishing and things like that. And now we have a few more that have come through. It says, I'm a white Southern queer working class millennial. My most important values are honesty,
Nice.
integrity, and community. Well-being. The historical events that have shaped me are Columbine, 9/11, leaving my parents, and my faith community.
Wow. Yeah, and this is really kind of telling. Thank you, Josh, because all of the dimensions of our diversity kind of contribute to the way we interpret and we see the world. And that brings me to kind of the next slide, which is that meaning is assigned. And that when we look at behavior, we interpret other people's behavior and what is happening through our own cultural filter of what our own culture or our own life experiences tell us what is happening. So for example, if our world dimension have taught us that someone speaking quickly and loudly, waving their arms frenetically is kind of angry or exasperated, then that is what we will interpret that is happening. When perhaps that the dimension in that person's culture might lead one to assume that the person is jubilant or excited, right? So something that might come across as, oh my gosh, this person is really angry. In reality, the person might just be very excited and very, very, happy. But that certainly has happened oftentimes. I can tell you at our organization, when two of our, when I'm speaking, for example, with my boss, and we both are very kind of animated people, and we're kind of waving our arms and raising our voices, but we're not really fighting. But people will think that, we had this huge fight, and it's like, how can you talk to your boss like that and whatnot? And typically that comes from people who are not kind of quote unquote in, right? And so it's interesting because we end up again assigning meaning based on our own cultural filters. So for instance, I could say, what would your reaction be if someone comes in late to a business meeting, right? And what would we think if that person comes in late? That itself, that perception has a cultural filter. What do you think if you see a woman carrying a heavy load while her male companion walks beside her? What do you think about splitting a cash prize 50-50 with someone who contributed 5% of the work? So all of these kind of questions, they're interesting because, immediately some people might either jump, for example, to, that's unfair, right? The person who contributed 5% of the work should not get 50%. And that's a very kind of individualistic type of value, as opposed to kind of like a more collectivist type of value. So I want to kind of jump into another exercise, and I want to invite people to take a piece of paper. I'm going to give you like 45 seconds. This is really, really short. So take a piece of paper, and you have two columns. Column on the left and column on the right, and you have column on the left has one choice, column on the right has another choice. So you have 1A and 1B. And I'm going to ask you to just jot down whether you agree with the column on the left or the column on the right. So just write 1 and then A or B, 2, A or B, and so on. So go ahead and take 45 seconds to look at this. I know 45 seconds seems like a long time when there's no noise. All right. If you need more time, please put it on the box. Don't overthink this. Just answer with the first thing that comes to mind. Did everyone answer? Anyone need more time, Josh? All right. So we're going to move on. Here's some more options. So the same idea. And if when you're done, you can just put finish on the box, on the chat box, so that Josh can know when there is a critical number of people who are finished. That would be great. All right, Josh, how are you doing?
We've got about 15 that have said finished, and they're just rolling in. So I think everybody is pretty close to wrapping up.
Okay, awesome. So now I'm going to give you, if you will, the answers. And they're not really answers. They're more like values. So if you put B for number 1, put an I next to your answer. If you put A next to number 1, put a C. If you put B next to number 2, put an I next to your answer. If you put an A next to number 2, put C. Number 3, if you put an A, put an I next to your answer. If you put a B, put a C next to your answer. For number 4, if you put an A, put an I next to your answer. For number 4, if you put a B, put a C next to your answer. For number 5, if you answered B, put an I. If you answered A, put a C. For number 6, if you answered B, put an I. If you answered A, put a C. For number 7, if you put a B, put an I. If you put an A, put a C. For number 8, if you answered A, put an I. For number 8, if you answered B, put a C. For number 9, if you answered A, put an I. If you answered B, put a C. And for number 10, if you put a B, put an I. If you answer A, put a C. Does anyone need anything repeated? Josh, does anyone need anything repeated?
I'm not seeing anything come through the chat box.
Awesome. So now what I want you guys to do is tally up all the I's and tally up all the C's. And if you have more than 5 I's, please put that on the chat. And if you had more than 5 C's, just let us know in the chat. So basically, let us know if you're I or you're a C on the chat. And Josh can let us know what the critical number is, like what most people are showing up as. So Josh, you can just kind of read it aloud as people are putting in their answers.
I, C, even, I, C, C, I.
All right. So I heard 3 C's. Any other C's in the room? No?
No, they've stopped coming in.
There is stuff coming in. All right. So this is really interesting because this is an exercise to say whether you're kind of in an individualistic culture or in a collectivist culture. And most of us in the United States are in an individualistic culture, and many other folks come from what would be considered a collectivist culture. So let's kind of unpack that a little bit. If you're in an individualistic culture, you identify primarily with the self. Your individual needs are satisfied before those of the group. You take care of yourself. You kind of place emphasis on being self-sufficient, and you have independence, self-reliance. Those are greatly stressed. Those are greatly, values that are greatly valued. What else? So you generally tend to distance yourself psychologically and emotionally from each other. And you may join groups, but group membership is not essential to the identity or the success. And this is often associated with men and people in urban settings. Now, as you're reading this, I don't want you to think of this as either good or bad. It's just what it is. I sound like a therapist now. It really is. It just is what it is. And so, by the way, we took this exercise out of a Peace Corps handout. It's a training that they do around culture and what culture is. All right. So let me kind of go back to this third bullet here. Taking care of the self and being self-sufficient guarantees the well-being of the group. In other words, the group will be taken care of if you are taking care of yourself and if you are self-sufficient, because the group is made up of individual kind of pieces. Now, if you're in a collectivist culture, your own identity is in large part a function of the membership and the role of the group. So your identity is tied to the family or the work team. The survival and success of the group ensures the well-being of the individual and not the other way around. So that by considering the needs and feelings of others, you're protecting yourself. Harmony and interdependence of the group members are stressed and they are valued. Group members are relatively close psychologically and emotionally, but distant towards non-group members. And often this is associated with communities of color, and often it's associated also with women. I don't want to say that, and this was really weird coming from a male. Typically this presentation, my chief strategy officer does it, and she kind of stresses these or kind of highlight this point. And I want to say that these are kind of generalizations, which are very different from stereotypes. Generalizations, as in like, this is kind of like what in general terms, kind of anthropologists have noticed, but not, it doesn't always apply. So for instance, if you answered that you are you're embarrassed by individual recognition versus if I do a good job, I feel I have earned individual recognition. This is a perfect example of individual versus collectivism, right? If you are embarrassed by individual recognition, you feel like, really it's the group. Versus, no, I've done a really good job. I, as an individual, deserve this recognition. That's more of an individualist kind of mentality. Now, if you kind of think about this in the way that it plays out, for example, in shelters, in domestic violence shelters, you end up with an advocacy model that is very individualistic. So for instance, when we tell women in domestic violence shelters, you have to take care of yourself. You have to take care of yourself. You come first. For many Latina women, which is the population we work with many Latina women, this doesn't really resonate. And again, it's just generalization. It doesn't resonate because it's like, well, what do you want? How can I take care of myself if my children are not taken care of? If my mother is not taken care of? If my sisters are not taken care of? And so really, we're alienating people if we say you come first, right? The message is a little bit flipped. Now, it doesn't mean that you never say to a survivor, you don't say to a survivor, you stop saying to people, to survivors of color, take care of yourself first. That's not what it's saying. It just means that for some people, one message may resonate, and for others from that same group, it might not. So it's just to bring something to our level of awareness. So I kind of want to, let me just kind of jump to this next slide. So, all right, so American culture. It's important to note, I think, that no one American, not a single American is quiet like any other American, but a handful of core values and beliefs do underlie and permeate the national culture. These values and beliefs don't apply across the board in every situation, and we may on occasion even act in many ways that contradict those values, but they are still at the heart of our cultural identity. So, and again, when discussing cultures, there is a tendency to speak in very broad terms or to generalize. And this can be important to give us a broad sense of some of the issues and dynamics that can provide us a foundation that we can use to start. But the caution must be that we not stereotype and that we understand that these broad possibilities are just merely possibilities, and that we have to be flexible and we have to be open enough to help us formulate better questions and better services. That's really the end goal. So for example, we could probably safely say that English is the language spoken in the United States. However, as we know, other languages are also spoken in the United States. So 17.5% of people in America speak languages other than English. And well, I'll just leave it at that because I can go on and on about language access, but that is just one example. So, so generalization, which is very, again, different from stereotyping, can provide really important information, but it should not be applied universally. All right, so when we discuss American culture and some, or rather, I want to kind of discuss a little bit of American culture and some of the general values. So if you are an organization in America that is financially struggling or receiving a cut in funding of, let's say, $40,000, what would happen? Any ideas? Josh, feel free to read some of the answers. If you are an organization or if you are in a department and you're at your university that is struggling financially or is receiving some cuts in funding of, let's say, $40,000 or $50,000, what's going to happen? Any answers?
So
there's no right or wrong answer.
Come in and we have program fails. We have, I will have to lay off my staff. Parts of the program will be eliminated. programs that maybe my staff will have to be cut.
So these are great answers. Director what?
Director makes budget cuts. Other fees might be raised.
So these are great answers. So more than likely, a person would be let go, right? In America, more than likely, a person would be let go, as we just heard. But in other cultures, such like in Japan, for example, all employees would receive a cut in their salary so that all employees could maintain their position. So the value in the United States is, again, placed on individualism because taking care of yourself may guarantee the well-being of the group. But Japan leans more towards a collectivist culture, where the survival or the success of the group really ensures the well-being of the individual, right? So that's just kind of an example to kind of highlight how we see things through our lenses. So before I go on, I want to kind of ask, are there any questions or any concerns, any comments that people want to highlight or bring out at this juncture? I don't know if people are typing or, and just so you know, folks, I can't see your questions. Josh can see them, so he'll kind of interject and highlight some of the questions that you might have. No? No questions?
One just came through. Do you think that our work as advocates or another role can affect our perspectives on individual/community culture rather or more than our own personal family community culture?
Okay, can you repeat that? Do I think that
our work as advocates or any other type of role can be affected by our perspectives on individual/community culture or more than our own personal family/community culture?
Got it. Well, that's a great question. So if I'm understanding the question is, do I think that this kind of piece of culture, of individualism versus collectivism, can that affect our service provision or our work, right? I think that is the question. So the answer is absolutely. So as I gave an example earlier, in domestic violence shelters, oftentimes the message that we give to people is you have to take care of yourself first. And that is a perfectly fine message, and I think we should keep on giving that message. There's nothing wrong with it. But we have to just be aware that you might have a survivor of domestic violence, let's say, or intimate partner violence, who is not really responding or is not resonating to that. And so then you have to wonder, why is that? And the moment that you shift that lens and you say, okay, you have to take care, it's no longer you have to take care of yourself, but you emphasize, the working with the children, you emphasize working with, the larger family, like, the survivor's mother or the survivor's extended family, which our system doesn't allow us to do, right? But if you're able to do that, then you're reaching the survivor in a different way. And so the emphasis in the United States has been very individualistic. All the responses have been, individualistically based, if you will, and not collectively. So another example is the emphasis in the United States has been, you have to leave the relationship, an abusive relationship. And that is something that we've always kind of carried through, right? And there is nothing wrong with saying to someone, you have to leave the relationship, except that for some individuals from more collectivist kind of values or groups, they don't want to leave the relationship. They want the violence to stop, right? For many Latina women we've worked with, they say, no, I don't want to leave the relationship. I just want the violence to stop. And I don't want to leave the relationship for multiple reasons. He's the father of my children. He makes me happy in other ways. There are so many reasons that people, might not want to leave. And yet, in our advocacy, we've placed a great value and attached success to people leaving the relationship. And to give you an example, one of our advocates in Minnesota, she felt that it was a failure that one of the women had left the relationship and gone to our shelter. And then after 2 weeks or after a week, she left. And she said, how are you going back? Our advocate said, how in the world are you going back? This is terrible. You can't do that. And then the survivor said, this is not a failure. This is a success, because now he knows that I have a community that I can rely on. Now he knows that I can leave. And so from the survivor's perspective, that was a huge, huge kind of strength and a huge success, really, that she had, that community behind her. And so again, the way we do advocacy and our advocate herself, she could have committed the error of overemphasizing or placing the value of individualism had she not kind of taken a step back and realized, okay, how does the survivor herself define success? All right. So I want to move on to intersectionality really quick, and I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. It was, as you know, it was coined in 1999 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a Black feminist legal scholar, and it describes the multiple oppressions simultaneously. So it examines how intersections between identities interact with systems of oppression, which thereby contributing to systemic injustice and social inequality. So intersectionality is really, really important as we kind of understand how to work with communities of color. So I'm going to give you an example. When I experienced sexual assault when I was in college, I wanted to speak with a counselor, and the college provided someone that I could speak with, but I felt like I had to, if you will, educate the person on what it meant to be a gay, Latino, undocumented immigrant. And so the counselors really could not understand the intersectionality of my identity. And so the way the system was set up just perpetuated a feeling of isolation that I was already feeling at the time. So I ended up spending a lot of time kind of, educating this other person instead of me receiving the help that I needed. And so I want to be kind of clear that intersectionality doesn't mean that you have to understand all of the identities that someone might carry. But when we are talking about trauma-informed care, we have to ask ourselves what burdens we are placing on the victims and survivors when we are asking those victims and survivors to kind of explain their intersectionality to us. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm going to go through this, relatively quick. So, and again, so this does not mean, that in order to do our work from an intersectional framework, we should live or we should have all the potential intersecting identities. So you're not required to be a gay undocumented Latino in order to counsel someone like me who is. But instead, intersectionality really invites us to be aware of our own biases and experiences, to have cultural humility, and to spend some time on our own to engage in self-reflection. So let's, the request here is let's not expect people to teach us about their intersecting identities. We want to come with concrete questions that demonstrate that we have done some of our own work, right? We want to come with some concrete things to the table and not make it feel like the survivor has to educate you and all of that. So here's what I just kind of went through. Okay, so, all right, so intersectionality, doing this work intersectionally means that you have to be aware of your own biases and prejudices, and you have to have knowledge about an individual and their definition of culture. What we often do is we impose our definition of culture, what is acceptable on them, and what we're asking here is to kind of suspend our definitions or our understandings of culture and let people kind of tell us what their definition is. It also asks us to recognize professional power and avoiding the imposition of that professional power. So everybody's going, I think in several years ago, I would hear a lot of people say, the goal is for us to all have shared power. And the reality is that people don't have the same power. They don't come to the table with the same amount of power. There is professional power, but what we have to keep in check is how are we positioning ourselves to keep our power in check? And how do we recognize that professional power exists and we avoid imposing that professional power on decision-making processes and on programs that we do. This one we've kind of already gone over, listening to the individual and asking questions. This is linked to what I was talking about earlier about doing your own kind of homework, gathering information on victim survivors' interpretation of their own culture, Validating individual strengths is an important one because it would be easy for me to just be like, okay, you have to validate individual strengths. Let me kind of spend a little bit of time on this one or a few seconds. So one of the let me figure out how I want to put this. One of the phenomena that happens in gender-based violence or domestic violence in children world is that oftentimes Latino survivors, for example, will get in trouble. Latinas will get in trouble for what is called parentification. So you'll see that the Latina women will get in trouble with Child Protective Services because they're not watching over their children. They are the older children are watching over their younger siblings, and so they're like, oh, you've placed a burden on your older children, and you have kind of thrown away your responsibility as a parent. You're an irresponsible parent. Instead, we could look at it in a different perspective, that in Latino culture, we place a great emphasis on older children contributing to the family, right? This collectivist value of contributing to the family, of giving them more responsibility, greater responsibility, and it's recognizing their maturity to take care of their younger siblings. And so if I were to impose an individualistic or American value or strength, my interpretation of strength on that Latina mother who has her older children looking after their siblings, their younger siblings, I might remove the children from that home. But if I were to look at it as like, wow, this person really is recognizing her children's strengths, and she's recognizing the fact that her older children are mature enough and she's still supervising it, then I will have a very different outcome. So that leads us to that third bullet here of negotiating the acceptance of a different set of values. We have to kind of always kind of check ourselves and be able to negotiate a different set of values with ourselves. And finally, if we want to practice intersectionality appropriately, we have to develop linkages and collaborate with culturally specific community groups, which I'll talk to in a second. So if we had time, well, let me see what time it is. We have a little bit of time. So I want to kind of take a moment and ask you, how can we address and prevent the invisibility of students on campus when various parts of their identities are not visible to us? Well, let me just kind of suspend this question as a group conversation and just kind of jump to the answer. So the question that is going to kind of framework the next few slides are, how can we address and prevent the invisibility of students of color on campus when various parts of their identities are not there? So we have to live with a commitment to, again, do some self-reflection, listen to the voices of communities of color, and transform our systems based on feedback. This last one is really difficult to do because oftentimes we just want to keep on doing what we've been doing. And when communities of color tell us this is not working, we don't necessarily kind of listen. So specifically, let's jump to the part that many of you are here for. What are the characteristics of culturally competent campus programs? So culturally competent campus programs demonstrate an acceptance and respect for cultural differences. And they have put in the work and effort to be more inclusive, understanding, thoughtful, and intentional. So culturally competent campuses will end up developing structures and strategies to ensure that the students and surrounding communities participate in planning, delivering, and evaluating the campus program's core functions. They also implement policies and procedures to recruit and maintain a diverse and culturally and linguistically competent staff. Oftentimes, we just kind of, or oftentimes campuses will just kind of recruit one person of color, and then the burden of doing all of the culturally specific work really falls on that individual. And what we're talking about here really is integrating communities of color into the work, into all the aspects of the work that the campus is doing. A culturally competent campus also will provide a hierarchy of fiscal support, of professional development, and incentives for the improvement of cultural and linguistic competence at that program, at that faculty levels and at the staff levels. So in other words, when you have a program that is committed to cultural competency or doing culturally relevant work, you end up putting resources for developing the staff capacity to be able to work with communities of color. Now, campus programs that are culturally competent have dedicated resources for both individual and campus program self-assessments of that cultural and linguistic program. They will also develop the capacity to collect and analyze using variables that have meaningful impact on culturally and linguistically diverse groups. Now, I kind of want to talk a little bit about this one of collecting and analyzing data for meaningful impact. What happens oftentimes is that we end up asking communities of color to give us information about what is working, what is not working, and then we use that information against them. Or we take the data that they give us and we interpret it through our own lenses. Or we interpret it through our own lenses and we never go back to the community and tell them this is what we heard, are we right? And so I encourage you that if you are a campus that is analyzing data to understand kind of the impact of your program and what are the things that you should change, that you do a 360 mechanism, that you reach out to the communities, a 380 mechanism, that you reach out to the communities, that you get the information that you need, and then once you've kind of synthesized it, you go back to the community and say, this is what we've heard, this is what we want to do. And finally, campuses that are culturally competent, they practice the principles of community engagement, and there is a reciprocity in transferring knowledge and a reciprocity in transferring skills. So let's go a little bit on how this looks like in practice. But before, I kind of wanted to bring a quote that I really love about power. And this is from our Chief Strategy Officer, Ruby Weisstark, who says that power is the ability to decide what a problem is, to decide what needs to be done about it, and to decide who will be included to solve it, in what capacity, and with what resources. So as you marinate on that quote, I kind of want to talk about how culturally specific work can look like in practice. So I'm going to encourage you to use a multi-layered approach. And what does this mean? So let's say that you want to reduce gender-based violence through a traditional approach, not a multi-layered approach, but a traditional approach. So you might launch prevention efforts during orientation and throughout the year, right? You might go and do kind of know your rights and just different kind of prevention efforts. You might review and revise your policies to ensure that your campus is complying with CLEARI and with Title IX. You might even train first points of contact, like professors and RAs on the basics of sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking, right? You will even install blue lights along the campus. You will invite speakers to campuses who are inspirational and can, mobilize students. And you might even, put posters around campus or in the bathroom, for example, about where students can get help. Those are all legitimate, appropriate kind of things that you can do. But if you wanted to have a more culturally inclusive approach, if you want to reach, let's say, undocumented students or first-generation students, you would integrate the entire family in prevention efforts, which is not something that you typically would do in a traditional approach. I had a campus that said, we are, this is not necessarily in prevention, this is more in intervention, but they were saying, we don't have, we have a number of students who are, who need kind of counseling, but they're not going to counseling because the families typically don't believe that counseling is appropriate for their students, for their children. And so I don't know, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to give the services that they need. And so one of the frameworks that we said they needed to think about was start thinking about if you have identified that the family doesn't want this, then how are you including the family in that process? And then, of course, they were talking about confidentiality questions, which can get tricky, but and I don't want to necessarily get into, but there are ways that you can include the entire family in kind of responses. Another example is there is a campus in North Dakota called United Tribes Technical College. It's a tribal college and university, and when they do prevention efforts, they go with the entire family. They go with the mothers and the children and the husbands, because it's a living campus, and so it's the entire families are the ones that are doing kind of prevention work. Another point, if you want to reach undocumented or first-generation students, you might adopt a prevention curriculum that leads with an anti-oppression framework. So oftentimes, the prevention curriculum will be just about, you know, I don't know, I've been thinking about culturally specific approaches for so long that I'm having trouble kind of articulating some of the traditional prevention curriculums. Like, identify what are the warning signs, right? That's a typical one. Know what the warning signs are. Know when to intervene. Know the basics of domestic and sexual violence. You know, those are kind of the typical kind of prevention curricula that exists. But if you wanted to be more culturally specific, you would do an anti-oppression curriculum or anti-oppression framework. So, for example, again, to bring the example of the United Tribes Technical College, they have implemented a prevention curriculum that starts with understanding colonialism, understanding the aggressions that the federal government in the United States at the time did against Native American communities, how those policies disrupted and tore apart communities. And as a result, then they take their students through an exercise of kind of self-reflection of how all of those systems of oppression ended up perpetuating tremendous amount of trauma in the Native American community that kind of led to higher rates of suicide, higher rates of alcoholism, higher rates, you know, so a number of issues. And so then, then one of the trainers ends up saying something along the lines of, you know, hurt people hurt other people, or people who have been traumatized can inflict trauma if we're not aware of, or, you know, if we're not working on our own healing. And so then the prevention curriculum looks at not identifying the warning signs, but really working on yourself and working on your community, working on your family to understand legacies of oppression, so that you become liberated from those legacies of oppression, and you're not kind of you're creating a healthier community where sexual and domestic violence doesn't happen. And that can only happen if you are able to do an anti-oppression work. So it's a very different kind of approach than the traditional prevention curriculum. The other thing that you might want to do if you are wanting to reach undocumented students or first-generation students is you would understand the immigration remedies for victims of crime. So the U visa, for example. When I was assaulted, I was an undocumented student, and I didn't want to go to the police. I didn't want to report it. And so nobody told me that I could apply for a U visa, for example. And that would have been, you know, that would have kind of taken that pressure of not wanting to report off my back. If you wanted to reach LGBTQ students, you would create spaces that proactively welcome LGBTQ students. You will use gender-neutral language in your communication and your prevention materials. So you will ensure that law enforcement is aware of same-sex dynamics. So let me just kind of unpack one of these, the last one, understanding same-sex dynamics. So again, the campus programs ask that law enforcement gets training or receives training that is culturally specific, but many of them don't. So if you are looking at LGBTQ students and same-sex dynamics, you would help law enforcement understand that the threat of outing can be a dynamic of power and control. You could identify, for instance, how identity theft can happen for same-sex partners. You know, for instance, with my boyfriend, I take his ID, which would be difficult because I have hair and he's bald, or he's, you know, his head is shaved. But let's say that we both had hair, we both had our heads shaven, and I took his ID, and I was driving, and a police officer stops me for a traffic violation, but then he also finds, God forbid, cocaine in the car. And then because of that, then now I have a drug possession under my name. But in reality, because I have my partner's ID or driver's license, then he ends up who is the one who has that type of now conviction. Since this is being recorded, I'll just kind of put it on the record. I've never done any drugs, and I have never carried any drugs. That was just an example to highlight identity theft in same-sex partners and how it can be used as a way of power and control. And obviously, the same kind of dynamic wouldn't happen in a heterosexual relationship because it's really hard for cisgender male to steal his girlfriend's, for example, ID and pass for it. Law enforcement would also be trained on the dynamics of gender-based insults and how they can be used as a way to inflict power and control over someone. So, for instance, you are not gay enough. You are too gay. You're bisexual. You're saying that you're bisexual, but in reality, you just want to sleep around. You're too butch to be a real woman. Real women don't wear cargo pants, right? So those are kind of specific dynamics that happen in LGBTQ communities that might not happen in other communities. Or, for example, for the trans community, withholding medication like hormone therapy is really, really important. And if you withhold that from them, from trans folks, then that can have some serious health effects. So again, and for police to understand those dynamics becomes really, really important. So we kind of already went over this, and I want to pass it on to Mira. Yes, that's correct.
Pierre?
Yes.
Before we do that, I just had one question that came up while you were going through that, and it was, how would you include the family in prevention and intervention efforts if the family doesn't live close by, for example, at large state schools?
Right. So the question is, how do you include the family in prevention and intervention efforts? So I should have kind of put a caveat there that that oftentimes communities of color, for example, the Latino community, the majority of Latino students in higher education are in community colleges, and so then that's why kind of I brought that example. Now, if you are looking at including the family in the larger kind of context, that becomes a little more difficult, obviously, because you're working at a distance. But it's not impossible. So I'm trying to kind of synthesize some of this. So let me put it this way. Oftentimes, let's say that you're in my case an undocumented student who lives away from home, and in my case I could never see my family because I couldn't travel back to my hometown because I didn't have a driver's license, so I couldn't fly. My parents lived in Texas, and I lived in Massachusetts, in Boston, for college. And so it was kind of impossible for me to see them, and that became kind of an incredibly lonely, lonely first year in college. And so for students like me, we ended up creating like other families, right? We can be paired up with local families who are there, who are usually kind of given to international students, but not necessarily to domestic students. But they can be, kind of mentors or families of support. So what I'm saying with that example is, one, if we expand our definition of family and what, the communities of color themselves have conceptualized as their families, that may be a good way to start thinking of including family. So again, that doesn't fully answer the question. And if you send me an email, the person who asked the question, I can talk with you individually, and we can kind of talk about the dynamics that you're thinking about, and then we can conceptualize more kind of targeted strategies. Are there any other questions, Josh, that came in?
No, sir.
Okay, cool. So I'll pass it on to Mira. Mira, are you there? Josh, I don't know if Mira is on.
I see that she's unmuted, but I'm not hearing.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. So what I'm saying is like for international students, so I will specifically discuss about international students coming from Asia, but this can also apply to students from Africa, Middle East, Central and Latin America. And I will kind of also discuss about like the role of parents later on. So specifically, Monsoon United Asian Women of Iowa works with international students at our Iowa City office, which basically housed University of Iowa. And I kind of just want to go back to like why it is important that we talk about international students and sexual assault. Because if we are looking at stats, they are basically based on the 2015 stats. There are January 2014 data that there has been a 14.18% increase in international students when compared to like the past. Also, 76% of all international students are from Asia, and the top countries of citizenship for international students are coming from China, India, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan, Mexico, and Brazil. And I quickly Googled the international student stats basically at University of Colorado Boulder. So at University of Colorado Boulder, basically there are 3,060 international students just for the I think this is the 2016, fall 2016. And 1,925 of those are undergrad. So if we are looking at, Pierre, the next slide, Pierre, sorry. So I think it is important that when we are kind of discussing about international students specifically, that we have to look at the fact that there will be some adjustment difficulties because of languages, right? Just because that they are here does not mean that their English might be they might be really good in reading English or understanding it, comprehending it, but maybe talking might be still difficult. So therefore, it is important that sometimes that we have to see that there are also some language difficulties as well. And specifically when we're talking about sexual assault, because there might be, there are a lot of hesitation most of the time to talk about sex in itself because they see sexual assault as sex. Therefore, they will see it's like, no, I cannot talk about that. So therefore, those are the barriers. There are also like maybe some cultural misunderstanding. That's why I think it was so important that that Pierre kind of discussed about collectivism and individualism and just about culture, right? Because a lot of this young people are coming in and they are transitioning to a new culture. In addition to that as well, because there might be some transition in culture, there might be some barriers that includes misunderstanding, assimilating to the new culture, and then there's a lot of homesickness. In addition to that, there might not feeling that they don't feel like they are accepted. And then most importantly, there's also this pressure regarding high academic expectations, especially if they're coming from China. And if they are the one-child policy, therefore, there's more pressure of being that one child and doing really well. And I think, and then the next thing is about identity, because you have back in prior to, I think, 2000, the majority of international students are grad students. But now we have the majority of them are undergrad. That means that they are just graduated from high school. So you have to look at them in a way where they are basically teenagers, right? So when we are working with our campus work, we usually think about like child development, because these basically they're still teenagers and it's all about their ego. So there's a lot of like, who am I? Also, there's a big difference, especially for Asian students, like the so-called FOBs. I don't like that term, FOBs, or fresh off the boat. So they will be called like the newly immigrant students. They're just kind of like, so the Asian Americans will have will not feel like this affinity with the newly arrived refugees or newly arrived immigrants, not refugees. But therefore, there's going to be a lot of like maybe even, for example, at our campus, sometimes there are misunderstandings with our staff who are Asian Americans versus to the ones who are international students. Also, there's going to be like a lot of the disconnect with the home country. Therefore, like they are really caught in between of those two cultures. So when Pierre was basically like you were all doing the exercise about collectivism versus individualism, I was having a difficulty because I came to this country like as a teenager, and I can be both, right? So a lot of these young people who are coming in, they could also be both because they are basically straddling both culture. They will they will feel like this, the so-called campus environment might be very individualistic, but in reality, sometimes there is in conflict with their own collectivism way of doing things. And collectivism sometimes can be a barrier in really seeking assistance, but it can also be a way of using that as a strength to provide those services as well. And then this really issue about like, where do they really fit in? So again, it's about the ego, okay? And then Pierre, next, yeah. And then also this issue of loneliness. I remember that they are away from their parents, and according to an article that we basically was like sharing, there were like about 40% of foreign students in the US have no close friends on campus, and there's a lot of culture shock of loneliness. So therefore, they feel really like isolated, although they might be in coming from a culture that is collectivist, but then when they come to this country, they become really isolated. So there's a lack of support for them. Also, community awareness, there's really not a lot of support, especially for international students. And most importantly, like if they were seeking services, especially for healing, especially for talk therapy, that there might be some there's a lack of qualified culturally specific counselors. And then most importantly, since it's about sexual violence, there might be a culture of silence. So therefore, they will not seek assistance, especially if they don't know that there are some resources out there, okay? Next one. And then when sexual assault happens, they will also struggle to find right resources because they might not be familiar with the laws or services. And then they do not understand what will happen, right? And then most importantly, what does justice really look like for them? Because most of the time, the perpetrator or the one who did the harm might be someone from their own community. Therefore, reporting might not be the best solution for them because that is someone from their own community or someone from their own town. So therefore, like, would they so-called have someone deported or have someone report to the police and then someone can be like a family friend back home. So therefore, there's a lot of burden for a lot of the survivors and victims. And then they are really afraid to be deported. So therefore, they might think that reporting the sexual assault they might end up getting deported. Okay. All right, next one. In addition to that, I think there is a lot of international students. Basically, in order for them to keep the student visa, they are required to take at least 12 academic credit hours. So if they decided that if they were sexually assaulted and they cannot concentrate in taking classes, it's really hard for them to attend any classes. Therefore, they might have to drop at least half of that. So a lot of them will end up withdrawing from the classes. So therefore, they might end up they have to go back home because they are no longer they can no longer stay in the country because the fact that they were just out of status. So again, it is crucial that when we're working with international students, that they understand this, that we as an advocate also understand this requirement, and then working with the university, working with the counselors or the academic counselors is really, really crucial. So those are just the barriers. In addition to that, there's also a stigma that associated with friends, circles, and off-campus communities. So if they have reported that they were sexually assaulted, since it is a small community, it is not going to be everyone basically will know. So again, it's that So are they willing to even report? Because everyone will know what happened, right? Again, that can result to more isolation because of them reporting. And then that will further distance them from the school, friends, family, and therefore that they will be more isolated. So these are just like if we don't provide those services, these are basically can be the impact for survivors of sexual assault who are international students. So what are the effective practices? So in Iowa, the majority of the work that we're doing is the majority of the practices that I will share is really coming from our work with the University of Iowa. So Monsoon is a culturally specific organization that provides direct services and also prevention to the Asian and Pacific Islander communities in Iowa. But we also have an office in Iowa City, and our main office is in Des Moines, but we have an Iowa City office that really focuses on campus. And since our inception, since our establishment or becoming a 501c3, we've really we took our time in building our relationship with University of Iowa. And for us, I think, I'm not sure, but I think that University of Iowa is the only university that has a really good relationship with a culturally specific program. So for us, it's a really great model, because when Pierre was talking about the multi-layered approach, it's really it's really the epitome of the multi-layered approach. For example, whenever for the orientation, we are part of that. So University of Iowa will ask our staff to basically present with or co-present to international students about domestic violence, about sexual assault. So we are always part of anything that they do. It's also like important that another example that that is crucial is also like reviewing and revising compliance with Clery and Title IX. University of Iowa had asked us to kind of even be part of that. So therefore, it's really an authentic partnership. It's not just like, let's just add another culturally specific and then that's it. But for us, I think University of Iowa is really like authentically collaborating with Monsoon. Another tactic that we have done is we have used is really collaborating with not just community-based organizations, but also student organizations on campus. So we basically had partnered with the Asian Pacific American Cultural Center at University of Iowa, the Women's Resource and Action Center, the local SA Crisis Center, RVAP, which is the Rape Victim Advocacy Program. We've also worked with a sorority in the fraternities, and then the Asian American Alliance. So we've done a lot of events with with the different organizations. Okay. In addition to that, we also then work with the Indian Student Alliance with, for example, last year we did a henna that heals. So a lot of prevention work, not just intervention. And then Chinese Students Association, we've worked with just working with them about ESL courses. And then for the sorority, specifically for the API, basically we did the training with them or a workshop, and then we did a safe sex, healthy relationship presentation. And then we did a lot of collaboration with the student organization with the Sexual Assault Awareness Month. For example, we did the Yoni Kibat. So we had students and our staff doing, working with a reading of South Asian version of the Vagina Monologue. We did a lot of spoken words. And then in addition of that, of course, there's Facebook and Instagram. So we did a lot of community outreach effort with a lot of student organizations. Okay, next one. And I think this is the most important tactic that we've used is a peer-to-peer advocacy. We basically had hired international students of the same age, same native language, and same culture with the victim. So basically, at our Iowa City office, we have, I think, 4 staff who are Chinese students who speaks Mandarin, and some of them speaks Cantonese. And then we have Asian Americans as well. So, and then we are now at Grinnell College and at Drake University. And then we're also doing we're trying to do more work with ISU, with Iowa State University. So it is really important that you will hire individuals who are from the community to do the work. So it shouldn't be someone who's my age, almost 50 years old, or right, to do this work of doing community outreach, but it should be someone that's like maybe the same age. And then it is also important that they will have, that they will get training on DV and SA. So it's as if like they are, basically they will be advocates, right? So it is important that they also receive those training and at the same time doing community outreach.
Hello.
Any questions?
Yes, actually. Somebody wanted you to clarify just a little bit further what you meant when you said when things really happen, quote unquote.
Okay, so when things happen, so that that means like if sexual assault had happened, right? So that's what we meant. If things had happened, like, or if they are basically became victims of not just sexual assault, but dating violence, domestic violence. So therefore, that's what we meant by that.
And that's all the questions we have for right now. Thank you, Mira.
Also, I kind of want to bring up the issue of a lot of our work is, I think we have to understand that international students will end up going back home for vacation, for holidays, right? So it is important as well that how then do we continue the healing when they go back home? So what we've done is then we started providing maybe a counseling one-on-one with our peer advocates or an advocate that has been working with them online. So that's what we've been doing, because in the past we've had like cases where if they are from South Korea and it's like vacation time, they will go back home and they will ask, can we continue the conversation, or what if I need any help? I don't want to like share my stories again. And then we will just basically say, just contact us. Is Google Chat or Skype might be good. Then we will basically provide that. So it is important that we continue that, or we just basically let international students know that if they need any, just like someone to talk to them, because usually for SA survivors, it's really just about being heard, right? Someone that can listen to them. And so it is important that if there might be an advocate in your organization that would like to continue that, so find ways in maybe the virtual counseling. We don't know yet which is the most safest or so-called the best so-called platform for if it is Google Chat okay, is Skype okay, is it like safety wise? So therefore we're still kind of searching for that. And in addition to that, our campus staff, we are basically, our campus work is funded by OVW under the culturally specific program. And one of the tangible product that we need to create is basically a resource list for international students from Asia, like different organizations. So basically we just finished that resource list, and we can also share that to any organizations that would like that, but we are just getting the final approval from OVW to share that. But we have that. So then if you have a survivor who is originally from India and will go back home because of vacation or maybe during break, they will have an access to a basically an organization that can continue the work. We also, what we've done with this resource is like we also called the organizations and basically had asked them, what do you provide? So you will basically have a list of that. And then I think when we are talking about parents, I think we have to understand that that they are far away. So it's really sometimes very difficult for international students or for us organization to build that relationship with the parents. or to include the parents. So we have to kind of, if there are culturally specific program in your area, just kind of reach out to them and basically build relationship and see how you can partner to work together in order to better to better services for international students, and not just for the Asian students, but for all students who are coming from another country. Okay, Pierre, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so. I thought that was fantastic. Those are some great points and great tips. So thank you. I don't know if there are any folks who have. We have a few minutes for questions and answers or comments. If people would like to ask us, here's our information in case you want to reach out to us.
I have one question that came through, and it says, would you recommend a school has international students consult on the sexual assault policies for the school?
What do you mean, like consult who? The students, the international students?
Correct, in creating and forming or maybe revising the sexual assault policies for the institution.
I think that would be a great practice. So if there might be a student organization that's specifically for international students, and there might be students who are interested in gender-based violence, because I know at Grinnell College here in Iowa, there were like a group of students that created a reaction to the Title IX and basically the policies at Grinnell. So for us, I think it is important that we get the opinion of the population that will be affected by policies and procedures, and just getting there. I think for us, we provided that with University of Iowa. So I think it's a great practice. So if there might be a culturally specific program that works with a Latino organization, or it's a Latino organization, therefore like working with a Latino organization saying, can you just review these policies and protocols? Is this, what do you think? How do you think these policies and procedure will affect the Latino community, or if there's an African immigrant organization, even just asking, I think is important.
And there are also different kind of policies and procedures, right? So we're talking about, one of them would be like the disciplinary policies, and the other one is, for example, the policies and procedures that come about through law enforcement. So for instance, what if you had a I hear myself in the background, but what if you had a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault who came forward and said, you know what, I can speak and write English well enough to do well in my classes, but I cannot process this trauma in English. I have to say it in my native language. And that a lot of studies do show that, right? That like people who have experienced trauma prefer to explain it in their own terms, in the language that is familiar to them, and that is native to them. And so if a law enforcement agency or a campus security agency doesn't have the processes to respond to that effectively, it can cause some serious harm. So for instance, what if a university says, oh, okay, well, no worries, we'll accommodate you, we're gonna call the Spanish professor. Well, if that Spanish professor happens to also be your mentor or knows your professors, that can make you feel really uncomfortable in terms of language access. So that's not really the best language access process that you can have, right? Or if your policy ends up being, we're just going to hire bilingual advocates or bilingual investigators, or just bilingual advocates, or bicultural advocates, that automatically does not mean the person is qualified to be able to help the person in that native language. And so when you're looking at policies and procedures, look at all the kinds of, what I would encourage you to do is look at all the systems within your university that a survivor might encounter, and examine those systems, examine the policies and procedures within those systems. So we're not just talking about the disciplinary process, we're talking about the advocacy, we're talking about law enforcement, we're talking about a number of departments that people might, be receiving services from.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Anything else, Josh?
I have one question out to the group. Somebody typed into the chat box that they were wondering if we could create a listserv out of the attendees for this webinar today, just so everybody can share resources and ideas with each other. So if everybody listening in could put like yes or no on if you would like this to happen, and if you feel as though you would actually use that listserv, if you could type yes in, and then if you don't think so, please type in no, just so that I can kind of gauge the amount of interest. And if there's enough people interested, and I'm seeing yes, 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 so it looks like we might get into potentially creating a listserv for the everybody that's been listening in today. I will have to talk to the rest of CCASA staff to talk about setting all of that up, but I will mention that in our follow-up email as well. But then another question to you all is, how did you find students to become peer counselors? And I assume that they mean, culturally specific, or in the immigrant students becoming peer counselors. How did you attract those types of students to do that type of work?
So it's really strange, but we basically did a lot of community outreach in Iowa City. So a lot of, we even had board members who were professors, who are professors. So therefore, there might be professors in the social work department or even in the sociology, and they might have an international student who might be in that program. Therefore, then they will say, oh, might be a great program if you're interested in doing some internship with them. Maybe you can do your so-called social work, field work, or practicum with them. So it just kind of like word of mouth. And then we did a lot of tabling. We partnered with the international ISS, basically. So the international program, we partnered with them. And then through that, even though they might be in the business, their major might be business or sometimes accountant, especially here in Des Moines, but they are interested in doing some community work. So therefore, then they will volunteer. And then I think the most crucial thing is really like paying them to do the work. So then you have to then work with them to get the OPT. So there are also like ways that you can hire international students and pay them, because I think it is important that we don't do, yes, volunteering is all good, but sometimes I think it is crucial that we also like pay young people. So we also our international students staff are paid, but they have to get permission from the school to do that, to do the work. So it's just really doing a lot of outreach, getting your brochures in that language. So I know there's maybe Colorado has a lot of Chinese students, so maybe having it in Mandarin, or Cantonese, and then saying like you're looking for individuals who might want to volunteer and just really learn about your organizations, and then go from there. And then everyone then will know about your organization, and then everyone will end up like saying like, oh, I want to work there, and that's how we did it. We just did a lot of community outreach.
And Josh, I also wanted to mention, since we're running out of time, so there is the website for OVW that has all kind of the DOJ kind of approved, or I want to say sanction, kind of has like the green light in terms of best practices for campuses, can be found at changingourcampus.org. So if you go to changingourcampus.org, you'll find a plethora of resources in there, as well as other trainings throughout the year around how to do intervention and prevention work in campus settings. And it really is all free. It's really a fabulous wealth of information in terms of kind of sample policies, federal guidance, prevention models, et cetera, et cetera. So changingourcampus.org. And the final thing, since we are running out of time, the reason we started this presentation with kind of the basics of what intersectionality is, culture, anti-oppression, all of that, is that we find that oftentimes campuses are not really reaching communities of color or international students because they themselves haven't done the work around training their own staff and their own and their own departments around the issues that we covered, right? Around what culture looks like, how to do self-examination, et cetera, et cetera. So we wanted to kind of model that and show you how it can be done. Although these are obviously trainings that take, weeks and weeks or many, many days that we've done them in, and this was compacted. But just to highlight the importance that if you are really kind of committed to doing more work with communities of color or international students, those basics are extremely important, because again, what we find is that many universities end up doing, kind of reaching out, doing outreach engagement with communities of color and international students without having done the work. And so then they end up replicating models that don't work in those communities, or replicating models that, even worse, do more harm. And that's something that, we definitely want to avoid. Anything else?
Mm-mm.
Well,
I mean, we could talk about this all the time.
Absolutely. But sadly, we are out of time. So I just want to thank you again, Pierre and Mira, for all of this wonderful information. And thanks again to everybody else who joined in on our conversation today. And before I let everybody go, I just want to mention CCAS's next webinar coming up in November. It will be presented by Leo Martinez and Jose Juan from Casa de Esperanza of the National Latino Leadership or National Latina Network. The title will be How to Invite Latina Males, Identified Persons in Addressing Gender-Based Violence. It will happen on November 10th from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Mountain Time. So please be looking out for the registration link that will go out in our e-blast at the beginning of next month. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and please do fill out the survey that'll pop up as soon as I close down the webinar for us all. Hope you all take care, and talk to you soon. Bye.